Have you ever held a dollar bill in your hand and truly considered what it is? It feels real, tangible, a solid piece of paper that represents value. But what if I told you that its value is an illusion? What if the very foundation of our economic system, the creation of money itself, is a process far stranger and more fragile than most of us imagine? It begins with a single, startling fact. The United States Federal Reserve has the power to create trillions of dollars out of thin air. They don't print it in a vault or mine it from the ground. They simply will it into existence with a few keystrokes on a computer. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's the documented reality of modern central banking, and understanding this process is the first step toward unraveling one of the most significant financial stories of our time: how the world's most powerful nation became entangled in a debt that, by its very design, can never be repaid. To begin this journey, we must first confront the nature of money itself. The dollar in your wallet or the digits in your bank account are not wealth in the traditional sense. They are not gold, silver, or any tangible asset with intrinsic value. They are, in fact, debt instruments. Look closely at a US dollar bill, and you'll see the words Federal Reserve Note. A note is a financial term for a promissory. Nota formally. Every dollar created is a token of debt, a claim on value that doesn't yet exist. It represents a promise from the federal government to honor that debt. This fundamental shift from asset-backed currency to debt-based currency is the key to the entire system. When you hold a dollar, you are not holding a piece of America's wealth. You are holding a piece of its debt. This seemingly small distinction is what allows the entire financial structure to be controlled and manipulated, because whoever controls the creation of debt ultimately controls the economy. This brings us to the central player in this story, the Federal Reserve. Its name is a masterpiece of branding, designed to inspire confidence and suggest government authority. The word federal implies public ownership and accountability. Reserve suggests a stockpile of assets, a secure backing for the currency. But both implications are profoundly misleading. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private entity, a unique public-private hybrid structured to serve the interests of its owners. It operates with a degree of independence that no true government department enjoys. While the President appoints its Board of Governors and the Senate confirms them, the Fed's decisions are not subject to direct approval from any branch of government. It is a central bank with immense power, operating behind a veil of governmental legitimacy, yet fundamentally separate from the democratic structures that are supposed to govern the nation. Its true allegiance is not to the American people, but to the banking system it was created to protect. The true ownership of the Federal Reserve is one of the most carefully guarded, yet publicly available, secrets in modern finance. The system is not a single, monolithic entity based in Washington, D.C. Instead, it is a network of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, located in major cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. And who owns these 12 regional banks? The answer is not the U.S. government or the American people. They are owned by the private commercial banks operating within their respective districts. These are the very same names you see on every street corner and in every financial headline: J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, and other major financial institutions. These private banks are the member banks, and they are the legal shareholders of the Federal Reserve System. This structure effectively creates a banking cartel, a private club of the nation's most powerful financial players who have been granted a legal monopoly over the creation of the nation's money supply. They are not just participants in the economy. They are its architects, its gatekeepers, and its primary beneficiaries. The relationship between the member banks and the Federal Reserve is not merely symbolic. It is explicitly profitable. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the very legislation that created this system, contains a provision that is as astonishing as it is obscure. It mandates that all member banks, the private institutions that own shares in their regional Fed, are legally entitled to a fixed 6% dividend on their investment each and every year. This is a guaranteed, risk-free profit, paid out like clockwork, regardless of the health of the economy, whether the country is in a boom or a bust. Whether ordinary people are prospering or losing their homes, these shareholder banks receive their 6% dividend. It's a feature, not a bug, of the system, a built-in mechanism to ensure that the owners of the cartel are always rewarded. This guaranteed profit stream solidifies the partnership between the private banking sector and the central bank, aligning their interests and creating a powerful incentive to maintain the status quo no matter the cost to the public. It is a direct transfer of wealth from the monetary system to its private owners. hidden in plain sight within the founding document of the institution itself. So, how does this grand system actually work? How is money conjured from nothing and injected into the economy? The process is a carefully choreographed dance between the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve. It begins when the U.S. government needs to spend more money than it collects in taxes, which it almost always does. To cover this deficit, the Treasury Department decides to borrow. It does this by issuing government bonds, which are essentially IOUs promising to repay the borrowed amount with interest. In the past, the government would have had to find real investors, individuals, corporations, or foreign governments willing to lend it their existing money. But today, the primary buyer is the Federal Reserve. The Fed doesn't use pre-existing money to buy these bonds. Instead, it creates the money digitally with a few simple accounting entries. It credits the U.S. government's bank account with the required amount, billions, or even trillions, of new dollars. In exchange, the Fed takes the Treasury bonds onto its balance sheet. Instantly, new money enters the financial system, and the government is free to spend it. But there's a catch. This newly created money is not a gift. It is a loan. The government, and by extension the American taxpayers, now owes that money back to the Federal Reserve plus interest. This is the moment of creation. Debt and money are born at the exact same instant. This mechanism represents a profound transfer of power that occurred quietly in 1913 with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. Before this act, the authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof was explicitly granted to Congress in the U.S. Constitution. The nation's founders were deeply suspicious of central banks, viewing them as instruments of private power that could indebt a nation for the benefit of a few. They intended for the control of the money supply to remain in the hands of the people as elected representatives. But the Federal Reserve Act effectively outsourced this critical sovereign power. It handed the monetary reins of the entire nation over to a consortium of private bankers. From that moment on, the government could no longer create its own money debt-free. It had to borrow it into existence from this new private entity and pay interest. For the privilege, this shift was not just a technical change in financial policy. It was a fundamental change in the structure of power in America. It turned the U.S. government from the master of its currency into a perpetual borrower, forever indebted to the very banking system it was supposed to regulate. The power to create money, arguably the single greatest power in any society, was privatized. But creating money from nothing is only the beginning of the story. The real trap lies in what happens next when debt becomes permanent. Once you understand how money is created, the next logical question is a simple one. What happens when all that debt comes due? The answer to that question reveals the fundamental architecture of our modern economic system. A system built not on wealth, but on a perpetual and ever-expanding cycle of debt. It is a design that, by its very nature, ensures that the U.S. national debt can never truly be repaid. To understand why, we must first accept a counterintuitive fact. Every single dollar in existence today was born from a loan. When the Federal Reserve creates money, it does so by purchasing government bonds, which are essentially IOUs from the U.S. Treasury. This act of purchasing a bond simultaneously creates new money and new government debt. They are two sides of the same coin, inseparable from birth. This creates a profound paradox at the heart of our economy. If the government were to somehow acquire all the money in circulation and pay back every single dollar it owes, the result would be catastrophic. The entire money supply would vanish. There would be no dollars left in bank accounts, no cash in wallets, no currency to facilitate trade or pay for services. The economy would grind to an immediate and absolute halt. So, while we are told that paying off the national debt is a responsible fiscal goal, the very structure of our monetary system makes it an impossibility. Paying the debt would mean destroying the money needed to pay it, a classic catch-22. The system requires the debt to exist for the money to exist. This isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system itself, functioning exactly as it was designed. The debt is not a bug. It is the fundamental operating feature. The situation is made even more inescapable by what can only be described as a mathematical trap, a deliberate omission in the process of money creation. When a bank, including the central bank, creates money by issuing a loan, it creates the principal amount of that loan. If it loans out $1 million, it types $1 million into existence. However, it never creates the money needed to pay the interest on that loan. The interest simply does not exist. This forces the borrower, whether it's an individual, a corporation, or the government itself, into a desperate search for money that was never created. Where can this extra money be found? The only way is through more borrowing. Another loan must be taken out, not only to cover the original principal but also to service the interest on all existing debt. This mechanism guarantees that the total amount of debt in the system must always grow. It is a mathematical certainty. For every dollar of debt that exists, there is an additional liability, the interest for which no corresponding dollar was ever created. This deficit can only be filled by creating even more debt, which in turn accrues its own interest, requiring even more debt in a cycle that spirals infinitely upward. This is why the national debt doesn't just grow. It accelerates. It expands at an exponential rate because new debt must constantly be created just to pay the interest on the old debt. It's a treadmill that can only speed up, never slow down, and from which there is no exit. The system does not allow for a state of equilibrium or repayment. It demands permanent, ever-expanding debt to simply keep itself from collapsing. For the average citizen, this abstract financial mechanism has a very real and tangible consequence: the taxpayer burden. The interest payments on the national debt are not some theoretical number on a government ledger. They are paid for with real money, extracted from the real economy through taxation. Every year, a significant portion of your income tax does not go toward funding roads, schools, defense, or social programs. Instead, it is immediately rerouted to service the interest on the national debt. This represents a massive and largely hidden transfer of wealth. It is a silent tax levied upon the productive capacity of the entire nation, siphoning wealth away from the working population and funneling it toward the holders of the debt. Let's trace the path of this wealth extraction mechanism. It begins with the labor of the American people, the workers, entrepreneurs, and innovators who generate real value in the economy. A portion of the fruits of their labor is collected by the government in the form of taxes. The government then takes a substantial slice of this tax revenue and sends it to its primary creditor, the Federal Reserve, as an interest payment on the government bonds the Fed holds. But the Federal Reserve, despite its official sounding name, is a privately owned institution. The profits it generates from these interest payments, after covering its operating expenses, are distributed to its member banks, the largest private financial institutions in the country. In essence, money flows from the pockets of ordinary workers, through the government, and into the coffers of the very banks that create the money from nothing in the first place. It is a system of wealth extraction, elegantly designed and operating in plain sight. Throughout American history, several leaders have recognized the danger of this system and made bold attempts to resist it. President Andrew Jackson, in the 1830s, famously fought and won a war against the Second Bank of the United States, a precursor to the Federal Reserve. He saw a central bank with the power to create money as a grave threat to liberty, famously stating that the bold effort the present bank had made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it. President Abraham Lincoln, facing immense costs during the Civil War, chose to bypass the high-interest loans offered by private banks. Instead, he instructed the Treasury to issue its own debt-free currency, known as greenbacks, which were printed and spent directly into the economy to pay for soldiers and supplies. This act asserted the sovereign right of the government to create its own money. In the 20th century, whispers of this resistance continued. Both President James Garfield and President John F. Kennedy were said to have taken steps to reclaim the monetary power from private interests. Garfield, an ardent critic of the bankers' control over money, was assassinated just months into his presidency. And just before his own assassination, Kennedy signed Executive Order 11,110, which granted the Treasury the authority to once again issue silver-backed currency directly, bypassing the Federal Reserve System. While the full intentions behind these actions are debated by historians, they represent a recurring theme in American history: a struggle between a democratically elected government and a private financial power over who controls the nation's money supply. These historical attempts, however, ultimately failed to break what appears to be an unbreakable loop. The system's survival depends entirely on the perpetuation of debt. If the government were to reclaim its power to issue debt-free money, as Lincoln did, the primary revenue stream for the central banking system would be cut off. More importantly, the mechanism of control that comes with being the nation's creditor would be lost. The economy, as it is currently structured, is addicted to this steady infusion of new debt-based money. Without it, credit would freeze, asset values would plummet, and a severe depression would be all but certain. The system demands permanent debt to keep the economic engine running, creating a powerful incentive for those in charge to resist any and all attempts at fundamental reform. Ultimately, this brings us to the core issue of power and control. The old axiom, often attributed to Mayor Amschel Rothschild, states, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." When a private consortium has the exclusive power to create a nation's money, and to do so in the form of a loan that can never be repaid, it holds the ultimate power. It becomes the de facto master, and the government, along with its people, becomes the perpetual servant, forever working to pay off a debt to a creditor that created the money with a few simple keystrokes. The political debates, the elections, the laws passed by Congress, all of it takes place within a financial framework that is predetermined by an unelected and unaccountable power. In the beginning, we asked what happens when the debt comes due. But we see now that was the wrong question. The debt is designed never to come due. The real question was never who the Federal Reserve owes, it's who owes the Federal Reserve. And the answer to that is all of us. Thank you for watching. If you found this explanation valuable, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and clicking the notification bell so you don't miss our future explorations into the systems that shape our world.